The ground cracked open with a dull thump as Daniel drove a jagged rock into the soil, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool, artificial breeze of the Interstellar Academy's training field. Around him, students from a dozen different star systems had already set up sterile cooking stations, slabs of shimmering gel laid over grav, plated trays, translucent nutrient cubes being arranged with surgical precision, protein spores diffusing heatless steam under hermetically sealed domes. Meanwhile, Daniel Earthborn, Terran standard male, age 22, was on his knees, tearing up landscaping with a rock and a steel food tray bent into a makeshift shovel. "Instructor, the human is damaging the institutional terrain," hissed a voice, nasal and reedy. Instructor Threx turned toward a four-eyed Malkari student pointing at Daniel. "Should we not intervene?" Threx, whose species had evolved in oceans and communicated largely through chemical pulses, let out a flickering psi cloud. The assignment was clear: traditional cooking methods, no modern tools. Let us observe this peculiar method. Daniel didn't hear the commotion. He was too busy testing the pit's depth, 2 feet, and change enough. He stood and wiped the dirt on his Academy-issued jumpsuit, leaving streaks of gray across the knees. His hands were scratched and red. Not bleeding, but close. A nearby Firaxi student recorded him with 6 separate optical lenses, her voice chittering into her translator. Is he preparing a burial site? Perhaps the food is to be honored posthumously? "No," Daniel muttered under his breath as he hefted stones into a circle. "Not a grave. A barbecue." One of the Parquel, whose species absorbed nutrients through skin osmosis, recoiled. "Why does he need fire? Isn't the digestive work done by the body?" Daniel just smiled. "Not when you want it to taste good." The instructor tapped his data slate nervously. A blast shield shimmered quietly into place behind Daniel, just in case. The assignment had been given that morning. "Each of you," Threx had announced, "must prepare a meal using only traditional, non-mechanical methods native to your species' early civilization. No molecular restructuring, no plasma brazing, no autosynths." Groans rippled through the amphitheater. "Why?" a Yulgren had croaked, stretching his glistening neck folds. "This is culinary regression." "To understand nourishment beyond chemistry," Threx replied. "To grasp the cultural bonds food once forged, especially in primitive societies." Daniel had grinned. He was already thinking about fire. Now, hours later, the pit had taken shape. Rocks ringed its outer rim. A dugout channel would later serve as a vent. But the real challenge loomed in Daniel's arms, a bundle of dry wood he'd scavenged from the Academy's arboretum. Officially, all flora was strictly non-combustible for environmental safety. But someone forgot to consider driftwood-style fallen branches from the Terran biome exhibit. With careful reverence, Daniel laid kindling down twigs, leaves, shavings from his meal tray, and topped it with cross-stacked sticks. He crouched beside the setup, a flint in one hand, a curved steel bolt in the other. His fingers trembled slightly, more from anticipation than fear. Strike, miss. Strike. Spark, then nothing. Strike. Spark. Smoke. Still nothing. "Failure," whispered the Firaxi student. "This is inefficient. Antiquated." Strike. Spark. Smoke. Ember flame. Daniel leaned forward and exhaled gently. A curl of fire took hold, threading upward, hungry and wild. He coaxed it, fed it twig by twig, until the core glowed orange and heat rippled across the ground. A hush fell over the field. Then the wood caught with a low roar, flames licked the air. The sudden burst of heat startled a few observers into stumbling backward. One Zelvan collapsed entirely, stunned by the sudden intensity. Threx blinked all 4 of his eyes. "Is this standard Earth behavior?" Daniel looked up, grinning. "Only if you're hungry." Each student had received the same rations: protein slabs, tuberous starches, mineral blocks, and a small sealed pack of hydration gel, designed to be flavorless and efficient. Daniel unpacked his kit and stared at it with theatrical despair. "What, no garlic?" he muttered. He didn't complain, though. Instead, he trotted over to the Academy greenhouse, which connected to the training field. It wasn't cheating. The assignment said, "No tech assistance." It didn't say anything about being creative. He returned with a fistful of leafy herbs, 2 sharp-smelling roots, and a smug expression. "You are gathering non-certified flora," one student warned. "I'm seasoning," Daniel replied. With practiced care, he crushed the herbs against a hot stone, mixing in ground salt from a chalky outcrop near the perimeter. He sliced thin slivers from the root's close cousins to ginger, by his guess, and rubbed the mixture onto the protein slabs. A rich aroma began to rise from his hands. Aliens shifted uncomfortably. "That smells different," said a small-boned Arikari. "Bad different or good different?" Daniel asked, skewering the slabs on long sticks and placing them over the fire. The Arikari twitched his antennae. "Confusing different." The fire pit hissed and popped as Daniel worked. He buried tubers in the coals, wrapped in leaves. He placed a small metal pot borrowed from a maintenance closet atop heated stones and added diced starch, water, and root shavings. The stew began to bubble slowly. The scent drifted farther now, past the training grounds and into the open corridors. Several maintenance drones paused their patrol paths. A faculty member on the upper terrace stopped mid-sentence and tilted his head. A second-year, a clear student wandered close. "Is that combustion?" she asked nervously. "That's weaponized." "Nope, lunch." "Is it safe?" Daniel gave her a look. "Safe enough for me to eat first." He didn't mention the slight burn on his finger from when the pot slipped, or the scratches on his arm, or the smoke irritation in his eyes. Because that was tradition too. Cooking didn't come without a little blood, sweat, and tears, sometimes literally. An hour later, a crowd had formed. Not just students, staff, custodial crew, even a delegation of visiting planetary governors. All drawn by the unmistakable smell of sizzling meat, bubbling broth, and fire-roasted starch. Daniel's classmates were still staring at their nutrient cubes. Azarnid Noble took a cautious bite of one of Daniel's grilled protein skewers. His 4 ears wiggled. This is exquisite. It has flavor. It has burn residue," muttered a paranoid Zelpath medic. "Charred tissue contains polyaromatic hydrocarbons. You could be slowly poisoning yourselves." "You want another skewer?" Daniel asked. The medic hesitated. "Yes, please." Daniel chuckled, then winced as he flexed his sore hand. He'd been crouched for hours, tending the fire, adjusting food, hauling water, and burning calories faster than he could replace them. His shirt clung damply to his back, and his knees ached. But he wasn't done yet. Not until everyone had a plate. And at the rate the line was growing, he might need to build a second pit. Or teach a few aliens how to flip skewers. Which could go great. Or end in a flaming mess. Either way, he was all in. By midday, the fire pit roared like a living thing. The wood crackled in low groans as red-orange coals shifted beneath blackened logs. Daniel wiped his brow with his sleeve for the 100th time. His face was smudged with ash, hands chapped from heat and friction. One fingernail was cracked from splitting sticks too forcefully, and his thighs were starting to cramp from hours of crouching and standing in uneven rhythm. Still, he moved with purpose. The tubers he'd buried were ready. He used a long, flat piece of metal, scavenged from an old drone casing, to lift them from the embers. The charred leaves peeled away to reveal soft, steaming centers. He sliced one open, carefully, testing the give of the flesh with a flick of his finger. Perfect. A group of first-year students, species unrecognizable to him, all horns and glistening fronds, watched from a cautious distance, their wide eyes bouncing between the flames and the tubers like nervous animals at a campfire. Daniel gestured for them to come closer. They didn't. So, he set a small plate of sliced tuber down on a nearby flat rock and returned to his stew pot without a word. It only took a minute. Then a small hand reached out, snatched the plate, and vanished behind a bushy frond with a squeak. "How is this? Not incinerated?" asked Senior Cadet Yarshek, a towering biped covered in scaled ridges. He was peering into the stew pot with one eye, the other closed in what Daniel assumed was a nervous tick. Daniel stirred the broth with a carved wooden ladle he'd made from a branch and some twine. Indirect heat. Heated stones hold warmth without boiling the pot over. Old earth trick. Keeps things slow. Controlled. Yarshek squinted. Controlled combustion. Fascinating. Your species survived like this? For most of our history. Fire was the first tool that gave us power over our environment, Daniel said, nodding toward the pit. It let us cook meat, soften plants, purify water, and, well, do this. He scooped out a ladle of stew and passed it to Yarshek in a shallow, palm-sized bowl. Yarshek sniffed it. It smells. Better than nutrient paste? Yarshek sipped. His eyes widened. He staggered back slightly, mouth still moving, nostrils flaring. Then he looked at the bowl like it had just spoken to him. Do you have more? Daniel laughed, then grunted and rubbed his lower back. Working on it. By mid-afternoon, the training ground resembled a festival square. Several students had started helping, kind of. One overly enthusiastic Ridzari attempted to enhance the stew by dropping in a blue nutrient cube, certain it would stabilize the flavor profile. The stew instantly frothed into a chemical foam, bubbled out of the pot, and smelled like burnt tire mixed with soap. Daniel didn't yell. He calmly dumped the entire pot, rinsed it twice with clean water, and started over. The Ridzari looked devastated. Daniel patted his shoulder. Tell you what, you want to help? Grab more starch bulbs from the greenhouse. They grow in the red soil beds. The Ridzari perked up instantly and zipped off with 6 of his 8 legs moving like pistons. Another alien, tall, bony, with a gelatinous neck, held up a protein slab. I observed you applying what is the word, rubbing. Shall I attempt a rubbing? Daniel eyed him. Sure. Here, use this herb mix, and don't slap it like that, more like a massage. The alien blinked. Massage the meat? Daniel nodded. There was a long pause. I am uncertain if I feel pride or shame, the alien said, continuing to rub the meat in wide, exaggerated circles. The scent now saturated the air, not just around the pit, but trailing down wind channels, curling through vents and windows, seeping into corridors. A few security drones buzzed by, scanning for combustion anomalies, only to pause and emit confused beeps before returning to their patrol routes. Inside the administrative hall, Dean Harold Fa, whose sense of smell had atrophied after 3 decades on oxygen-lean planets, actually paused mid-meeting. What is that? The room went quiet. Someone coughed. Unknown. Possibly food? Back at the fire pit, the line of eager tasters had become orderly. Plates, makeshift ones, mostly scrap metals and tray fragments, were passed from hand to hand, species to species. Daniel no longer had to explain what he was doing. Instead, he simply focused. Cooking was his rhythm now. 2 protein skewers rotated slowly over the open flames. He tapped one lightly, listening for the faint hiss. When it didn't hiss, he added a few drops of herbal oil he'd improvised from crushed seeds. The fire flared, but didn't bite. He flipped the meat and moved to the tubers. His hands were trembling now, not out of fear or emotion, but pure, unfiltered fatigue. He was burning through energy reserves fast, and the ambient heat wasn't helping. His shoulders ached. His shirt clung like glue. Daniel, said a voice beside him. He turned, dizzy for a moment, and blinked at Instructor Threx. You are pale. Are you unwell? Daniel sat down on a crate and rubbed his temples. Low blood sugar. Probably dehydrated. Should have eaten something earlier. Threx scanned him with a small medical tablet. Your glucose levels are borderline. I recommend you cease activity and hydrate. I'm almost done, Daniel muttered, sipping from a flask of water. He ate a chunk of roasted starch from his earlier batch and waited as the dizziness subsided. He knew better than to push too far. Cooking for an entire academy was turning out to be less of a demonstration and more of an endurance test. You should let others assist now, Threx said. It has become more than a solo exercise. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, good call. He stood, stretching slowly to avoid a head rush. Hey, he called to a few students nearby. You've been watching. Think you can keep this going? An excited chorus of affirmations followed, though some of them sounded more like squawks or chimes. Daniel handed off his skewers, sat back on the crate, and let himself just breathe. It wasn't just a meal anymore. One corner of the training grounds was now filled with music, strange instruments brought from across the galaxy. One student played a vibrating glass tube, Another sang in 3 frequencies at once. Someone had started painting on the ground using food scraps and colored salts. Daniel saw faculty laughing. He saw a medical technician nervously biting into a third skewer while holding a bioscanner in the other hand. He saw alien students from rival cultures sitting together, sharing bowls. He saw a Faraxi child trying to roast a piece of mushroom too big for her stick. He walked over, gently took the stick, cut the mushroom in half, and handed one back. "Smaller pieces cook faster," he said. The child clicked in gratitude. By evening, only glowing embers remained. The last stew pot was empty. The protein skewers were nothing but sticks. And the tubers had been devoured so completely that someone was gnawing on the leaf wrapping just to catch residual flavor. Daniel was seated again, arms resting on his knees, chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. His back hurt, his knees throbbed, his stomach was finally full, but he could already feel the deep soreness setting in. He didn't care. The instructor stood beside him. "I believe your assignment has exceeded expectations," Threx said quietly. Daniel opened one eye. "Is that official?" "Unofficially official," Threx replied. "It has become a cultural landmark." Daniel chuckled. "So, does the cafeteria start offering Firepit Fridays now?" Threx made a note on his slate. "We are considering the implications." Behind them, students were still laughing. Azarnid was telling stories of ancestral desert feasts. A Malkari was attempting to describe the flavor of charred meat as molecular surprise. And an Aklir technician had just started crafting a portable pit design, muttering something about field deployments and morale boosts. Daniel leaned back, smiled at the stars flickering in the sky dome, and sighed. Whatever came next, they'd all remember this. A hole in the ground. A fire. And a human who cooked like the world depended on it. By the next solar rotation, the fire pit was gone. Not erased, exactly, just absorbed. The maintenance crew had shown up early, murmuring in polite confusion as they surveyed the charred earth and blackened stones. One worker tapped a data slate, then paused to taste a crumb that had fallen near a rock. He blinked once, then pocketed the crumb. An hour later, instead of leveling the pit, they built a bench around it. Daniel watched all of this from a shaded spot near the greenhouse, legs stretched out, his shoulders wrapped in a loose compression wrap issued by the Academy Med Unit. He'd pulled a muscle in his back yesterday. Not a tear, thank God, but a deep strain. The Academy's medtech had been thorough: non-invasive scan, anti-inflammatory injection, hydration IV, and orders to rest for 48 Earth Standard hours. "You do not sit still easily," Threx had commented during the medbay check-in. "No, sir," Daniel had muttered, his abdomen twitching every time he tried to sit up without groaning. So he sat now, obedient if begrudgingly. Across the training grounds, students were still talking about the fire pit. Some tried to recreate his methods. One group had dug a shallow bowl and started placing rocks in it with algorithmic symmetry. Another had rigged a slow drip broth system using empty hydration packs, repurposed straws, and a gently warming heat crystal. They were trying. That's what mattered. Lunch came, and with it, a realization. The cafeteria was half empty. Daniel had been invited to dine in the faculty sector, a privilege usually reserved for top-grade students or guests. When he arrived, moving carefully, with a limp from overused thigh muscles, the first thing he noticed was the scent. Grilled something, roasted herbs, and a faint sweetness. He blinked at the buffet table. The head cook, a stoic Gorshon known for following nutrient charts like gospel, was ladling out a stew that looked suspiciously familiar: Earth-style root vegetables. Soft, cooked proteins. Even a decorative herb garnish, crushed and scattered like confetti. Daniel's mouth twitched. The Gorshan noticed him and paused. "We attempted replication. Your method. Adapted for volume distribution." Daniel grabbed a plate. "Looks great. Flavors may lack your improvisational variability." Daniel took a bite. It wasn't perfect. A little too much water, not enough of the sharp heat from the roots he'd found. But still, warm, savory, real. "It'll do," he said, and the Gorshan blinked in what Daniel now understood as a smile. He returned to the pit later that day to find a student waiting for him. Small, nervous posture, 4 arms, eyes that blinked sideways. "I wish to understand," the student said, holding out a notepad. "Your method of flame invocation." Daniel smiled gently. "Fire starting? Sure. Got something to strike with?" The student handed him 2 round pebbles, clearly polished. Daniel looked at them. This might take a while. He showed them anyway, flint and steel concepts, airflow, kindling arrangements. The student took notes like a research bot. When they finally produced a weak flicker of smoke, they nearly dropped the rocks in surprise. "You tamed heat with stone," the student whispered. Daniel shrugged. "Our ancestors did, I just copy what works." "Your ancestors must have been formidable sorcerers. Just cold and hungry." That seemed to impress the student more than any sorcery ever could. Later that week, Daniel was summoned. Not to the infirmary, not to the field, to the administrative wing. The hall was full of polished floors, echoing ceilings, and subtle scent diffusers meant to accommodate species with scent-based memory. A few of them triggered his allergies, and he tried not to sneeze on the way to the chancellor's office. Chancellor Yevon was a soft-bodied being who floated in a hydro-suspension chair. She greeted him with a series of tone pulses, then spoke via translator. "Cadet Daniel," the voice chimed in gentle waves, "your recent assignment has had cultural consequences." Daniel sat carefully. His back still ached in a dull, manageable way, but only when he moved too fast. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "On the contrary," Yevon said, her lenses adjusting to study him. "You caused community." She passed him a digital tablet. On it, images from the past 3 days. Students gathered around imitation fire pits, shared meals, recipe exchanges. One Malkari student had written a full paper on the ritualistic thermodynamics of Terran heatcraft. Another had hosted a ceremonial seasoning event with spice packets collected from across 8 systems. "There is talk," Yevon said, "of incorporating traditional cooking modules into next year's diplomacy curriculum." Daniel blinked. "Seriously?" "Food appears to override bias," she said. "A noteworthy trait." There was a pause. Then she said, almost delicately, "There is another matter." Daniel straightened. "Yes, ma'am?" "We wish to designate you not as a culinary instructor," she said, "but as a cultural liaison, a bridge." Daniel blinked. "So what, cooking lessons?" "Among other things, perspective sharing, ground-level diplomacy, meal-based dialogue." Daniel rubbed his eyes. "I just dug a hole and lit stuff on fire." "And in doing so," she replied, "reminded us that bonding doesn't always come from protocols or translation software. Sometimes it emerges through smoke and spoonfuls." Daniel chuckled despite himself. "Can I say no?" "Of course." He thought about it, and realized he didn't want to. 2 days later, Daniel stood beside a half-built training module with a sign that read, "Earthen Culinary Traditions and Practical Hospitality, Optional, Elective, 3.5 credits." Several students had already enrolled. Some came with cooking tools, others came with notepads. A few brought nutrient gels and asked if they could be converted into pleasure stimulants. Daniel told them gently, no. At least not today. He was still healing, still walking with a slight limp, still taking anti-inflammatories and resting his back between sessions. But when he stood beside the new fire pit, cleaned and redesigned to include a venting system and safety stones, he felt the same steady rhythm. Wood, heat, smoke, and aliens gathering around, not to gawk, but to learn. One student asked, "Why bury the tubers again?" Daniel smiled. "Because they cook slowly, all the way through. Even heat. Less burn, more warmth." Another student frowned. "Warmth is not technically edible." "Give it a try," Daniel said. They did. Their eyes widened. "Ah," they said, "edible warmth acquired." Daniel chuckled. The new fire pit bore no resemblance to the first one Daniel had dug, with a rock and desperation. This one was symmetrical, reinforced with heat-resistant alloy rings, and equipped with temperature control sensors not for assistance, but for safety. Daniel had argued for simplicity. The academy insisted on liability protocols. Still, it worked. The flames burned real, the logs crackled. The air shimmered the same way, and when the tubers went in, buried in ash and stone, the scent spread just as it had before, rich, earthy, undeniable. Today's lesson was about slow heat. Every culture has pressure, Daniel told the class, stirring the pot slowly with his long-handled ladle. But patience? That's not always taught. A student with translucent skin raised his limb. You advocate embracing inefficiency? No, Daniel said. I advocate purposeful time. That's different. This, he gestured to the bubbling pot. This isn't about being slow, it's about knowing when not to rush. It had taken him years to understand that. His own life, full of deadlines and last-minute decisions, hadn't taught patience. The Firepit had. A lesson earned through charred fingers and tight hamstrings. By now, earth cooking had become a cultural phenomenon. Unofficially, of course. Officially, the academy still listed it as an elective. But the waiting list had quadrupled. A Firaxi parent wrote a letter to the administration, praising the program for teaching her child to engage with chaos through constructive ritual. A Czarnid governor had sent an ambassador just to observe the primitive heat convergence rites, who later ended up learning how to grill mushrooms. And someone still anonymous had written an academic paper proposing that the introduction of human-style communal eating could reduce interspecies tensions by up to 43%, citing the Firepit event as case study 0. Daniel tried to ignore the attention, mostly because his body was still recovering from his original overexertion. Though he'd returned to regular activity, the med unit still checked his back weekly. The pulled muscle had healed slowly, with realistic progression heat packs, targeted exercises, a few days on muscle relaxants when the stiffness became intolerable. He never made the mistake of shrugging off pain again. There was no valor in ignoring biology. One afternoon, Daniel walked the outer ring of the training grounds with a cart. Not unusual, he often gathered herbs, stones, or suitable wood on his breaks. But this time, he was accompanied by a Hareni student named Carl, who walked on 6 legs and asked questions faster than Daniel could answer. But how did your ancestors know which plants were not fatal? Trial and error, Daniel said, grabbing a small root. Usually more error. That is statistically terrifying. Yeah, welcome to humanity. They returned to the pit, where the rest of the class was prepped for roasting root bundles. Carl sat and observed, fidgeting occasionally. Daniel gave him a spare root. Want to try carving? I am not dexterous. Neither was I. Carl stared at the tool. Is failure acceptable? It's mandatory, Daniel said. Carl did try. It took him 4 cuts to get the blade facing the right way, and he gouged his own thumb once, not deep, just enough to draw translucent blood. He hissed, instinctively reaching for his medical patch. Daniel stopped him. Wait. Oh. He cleaned the cut, wrapped it in breathable fibercloth, and said, Now you're a cook. Carl blinked his lower eyes. I bled. We all do. It's how you know it matters. The final evaluation of the elective was non-traditional. Each student had to prepare a dish not to be graded on taste, but on intention, storytelling, and effort. Daniel moved between stations like a proud but exhausted father watching his kids mess up the kitchen. One group over salted their root stew. Another accidentally deep-fried a plant that turned their broth purple. A third managed to undercook and burn the same protein slab, which Daniel didn't even think was possible. No one failed. The entire point was learning. By the end of the day, a massive spread lay across a long table, cobbled from crates and cargo panels. Dozens of alien students sat shoulder to shoulder, tasting, laughing, arguing about spice levels, and trading what remained of their creations. Some even dared to critique each other. Daniel sat near the edge, plate in hand, ankles crossed. His fire pit blazed quietly behind him. Instructor Threx sat beside him. You have altered something fundamental, Threx said. I cooked some food, Daniel replied. Threx turned, all 4 eyes serious. No, you shared. You allowed yourself to be observed imperfectly, painfully, physically. You allowed your vulnerability to be tasted. Daniel took a bite of an accidentally sour root stew and chuckled. Sounds kind of poetic for a guy who once said meat was molecularly redundant. Threx gave a faint chuff. Poetry has its uses. There was a pause. Then Threx added, "The administration intends to make your course permanent. Optional, but foundational." Daniel nodded. "Good. You will be credited as founder of the Firepit program." Daniel groaned. "Not that name. It has already been published." "Of course it has." That night, after cleanup, Daniel remained at the pit long after the last student had gone. The embers pulsed gently in the dark. He leaned forward, slow and careful, and added a final piece of wood. The flame rose briefly, catching the breeze. His knees still ached when he sat too long. His back still twinged if he turned fast. His hands bore faint scars from burns that hadn't healed pretty. And yet, he felt whole. Not fixed. Not perfect. But cooked through, like a tuber pulled from the coals, slightly charred on the outside, but warm and solid inside. The fire crackled beside him. A voice drifted down from a window above someone playing music on a Terran acoustic guitar, imperfectly tuned but sincere. Daniel closed his eyes. The Interstellar Academy had given him a classroom. He'd given them a fire. And somewhere between the smoke and the stories, they had all learned to eat together. No synth cubes, no flavor-neutral gels. Just food, shared the hard way. Because sometimes, the old ways didn't just survive. They fed the future.